Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Enter the Bible podcast. I'm Catherine Schifferdecker.
And I'm Katie Langston.
And today we have as our guest contributor and speaker Professor Amy Jill-Levine, who is the Rabbi Stanley Kessler Distinguished Professor of New Testament and Jewish Studies at the Hartford International University for Religion and Peace. She is also University Professor of New Testament and Jewish Studies, Emerita, Mary Jane Werthan Professor of Jewish Studies, Emerita, and Professor of New Testament Studies, Emerita, all at Vanderbilt University in Nashville. So, Amy Jill, AJ, as she goes by, is also the author of many works, many books. One we'd like to highlight, particularly for this podcast episode, is a book called Short Stories by Jesus, The Enigmatic Parables of a Controversial Rabbi. A book on the parables of Jesus published by Harper One. So thank you again for joining us, AJ. We're so happy to have you here.
I'm delighted to be with you.
Welcome. Good. So the question that we have for you today sort of comes out of a lot of Christian teaching and preaching, certainly that I hear, and I'm imagining that that others would relate to it, which is sort of, there seems to be an emphasis in a lot of sermons and things like that about the outcast and the marginalized, and the duty to how we ought to relate to such folks. And the question is, like, who are they in the scripture, in the New Testament? Who are the so-called marginalized and outcast, after all? So
yeah, it's a great question because people drop those
they
terms
do.
As if
it's like everybody must know when we say marginalized and outcast, but like
right, and then people in the church feel so much better because, like, we don't marginalize and we don't cast people out. We're totally inclusive of everyone, right? So what terms like marginal and outcast do is they set up a false image of what Jesus' first century Jewish context is by creating people who get labeled marginal and outcast, and then Jesus becomes the one who welcomes them.
Right. Yes.
So
it's bad. Yes.
It's bad gospel, and it doesn't actually do anything other than make people in the congregation feel complacent or think, oh, well, thank God we're not like those Jews.
Right.
So, in interpretation of parables, for example, when Jesus tells a parable about a woman who hides yeast in dough, it's coming up lectionary in the next couple of weeks, or a woman who searches for her lost coin, right? Women were marginalized and outcast, and by telling stories about women, Jesus is bringing them back to their full authenticity as co-equal with men. Judaism, in turn, is kind of comparable to the Taliban.
Right. No, right.
For my students. So, if I go to my text, I have books like Esther and Ruth, and then there's that nice book called Judith in the Deuterocanonical literature. And we have lots of rabbinic stories about women. So, how are they marginal and outcast?
Right.
And what is Jesus doing to make them less marginal and outcast? Because if he were really interested in that, they would be among the 12, and they're not. Right? That children are marginal and outcasts. And when Jesus says, welcome to little children, that Jews looked at children as like little nothings or little nobodies. No, I mean, kids are really, really important, which is why all these, desperately infertile couples are trying to have babies and they care about babies. And the same thing in the Roman Empire, even daughters were super important. So what we see is this artificial model where that children, if they disobey their parents, would have been thrown out. So in the parable that's usually called the prodigal son, that we would have expected, we Jews, that the dad would have been stern and wrathful and saying, okay, young man, go work for the next 30 years and then we'll see if you can come to dinner. And then they get surprised that daddy is generous, as opposed to, no, daddy's a dad. It was typical Jewish dad. My kid's home. I'm delighted. Or Gentiles are marginal and outcast, right? No, they're running the empire. So, or sick people are marginal and outcast. And it turns out that the vast majority of people who are disabled or ill in the Gospels are embedded in either kinship groups or friendship groups. The guy who's paralyzed isn't outcast; he's incast when they have to open up a roof to let him in.
Right.
Mhm.
That's incasting.
Mm.
Nor do Jews generally equate forms of disability with forms of sin. I mean, the major place where people get that is John chapter 9, hello, in a New Testament text, where the disciples say, who sinned, this guy or his parents, that he was born blind? It's kind of weird when you have blind people or sight impaired people in the scriptures of Israel, like Isaac's blind. But not because he's sinful, because he's like old and probably has macular degeneration. So to try to get away from this bad Jew and then all-inclusive Jesus, as opposed to say Jesus is marvelously inclusive, but that's part of his tradition, rather than something radical over against it. In fact, usually when I hear that Jesus is doing something radical, it's something that's a cheap grace sort of model for the church, and it's a misreading of early Judaism. The really radical stuff about Jesus is like, sell all you have and give to the poor.
Right.
That's pretty
That's
radical.
stuff.
Or hate mommy and daddy and kids and leave your wife. That's radical. Or you will see the Son of Man coming on clouds to judge people, and that's me. That's radical. Right? Not let's heal people. That's not radical. That's just grace.
Well, I think about, for instance, the greatest commandment too, right? When Jesus is asked, "What's the greatest commandment?" He quotes Leviticus and Deuteronomy, right?
Right.
First
Leviticus
Deuteronomy
9,
and then Leviticus.
Deuteronomy 6.
Yeah.
Right. And then my students say he comes up with love of God and love of neighbor. How original. And I'm thinking, no.
No. Is it?
He doesn't have to be original in order to be profound.
Right.
And he doesn't have to be yanked out of his Jewish context in order to be meaningful to people who are in the church's look. So I'm not a believer in Jesus as Lord and Savior. I mean, I think he was really smart. I think he's a brilliant teacher. And I can see all sorts of wonderful things about him. And I don't need to make Judaism look bad in order to do that. So I don't see why Christians need to do that.
Right.
I've had, so I teach Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, and I've had well-meaning students, dealing with the difficult text, like, the wanting to destroy the Amalekites, or, the wars in the Pentateuch or the Torah. They'll say something like, well, that was then and this is now, or that was the God of the Old Testament, but I'm so glad we have Jesus, kind of thing. And I know that I always respond, look, the God of the Old Testament, there is only one God, right? It's not, God doesn't change. But how would you respond to that, AJ?
There's a scholar named Emerita who actually produced this worksheet on, if you think it's Old Testament God of wrath versus New Testament God of love, let me show you the verses.
Yeah,
Right. Exactly.
When I get some of that junk from my students, I'm just inclined to say, fine, the Lord is my shepherd who leads me beside still waters and restores my soul. But you are condemned to the outer darkness where there's wailing and gnashing of teeth, right? You have a sadistic dentist. You think the flood was bad? Have a look at the book of Revelation, which makes it like a walk in the park. Or Sodom and Gomorrah. Well, Jesus pronounces woes against entire cities. Woe to you, Capernaum. Woe to you, Chorazin. Woe to you, Bethsaida. Not because they were doing bad things, but because they didn't believe in him, which is not something that they actually have a choice about, because belief is not something you choose. Belief is like love. It's either there or it's not there. You don't do a cost-benefit analysis on it.
Yeah.
So it's the same God, and when people come up with these God of wrath versus God of love stuff, it shows complete ignorance of the Bible. Bible. It's Marcionism. It's a heresy. So it's theologically unhelpful, and for some reason, those stereotypes just keep coming.
Yeah. And I think you hit the nail on the head when you were talking earlier about Christians who want Jesus to be radically inclusive and loving and all of that, and by doing so in the way that you're saying, by contrasting him to the Jews or the Pharisees or the Sadducees or whoever, they are inadvertently being very exclusive and condemning. in the process.
Yeah, let alone being historically
Yeah,
inaccurate.
right.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah.
And
Well, if you don't mind, could you say a word about the Pharisees and the Sadducees? Maybe just provide a little bit of historical context of those, and how are they? How do we? I think that Jesus is closer to a Pharisee uh, than most preachers would think about, right? If you think about the different Jewish groups and sects, including the ones at Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, how does Jesus fit into those groups of the first
Well,
century?
the only reason we spend all this time talking about Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and Zealots is because Josephus, the first century historian, did. He's talking about, at most 8 to 10% of the population. And what he does, if you actually read Josephus, which none of these people do, is to say, well, the Pharisees are like the Stoics, and the Sadducees are like the Epicureans, and the Essenes are like the Pythagoreans, like mystical mathematicians, and the Zealots are kind of like Pharisees with knives. So I mean, it's a very, very small group of people. So to try to fit Jesus into that mix would be like saying, well, everybody in the United States is either a member of the Moose, the Elk, the Knights of Columbus, or the B'nai B'rith.
which one was Jesus? Right. Yeah.
He's closer to the Sadducees on divorce legislation, where he says, don't get divorced. There's a Matthean loophole, but it's basically don't get divorced. He's closer to Pharisees on things like resurrection and action. He's closer to the Sadducees in terms of not washing your hands before you eat. Because what the Pharisees were trying to do is extend priestly privileges that you would have in the temple out to everybody. Following Exodus, you're all supposed to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Language that First Peter in the New Testament picks up. In 2017, there was a major conference at the Pontifical Gregorian Institute in Rome on the Pharisees, a big international conference. The proceeds from that conference were published by Erdman's in 2021. I think it was 2021. I'm the co-editor along with Joseph Sievers, who's a priest in Rome. We're right now working on a German translation of that. And then Joseph and I just signed a new contract with Erdman's to do a less academic, more popular version with a focus on how to preach texts about the Pharisees, like the woe to you scribes and Pharisees in Matthew, for example, or the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. Who are they? They're a lay-led group. They're interested in extending priestly privilege. They're interested in making things easier rather than harder. So they're the liberalizers. The Dead Sea Scrolls refer to them as seekers after smooth things. They just make things a little bit too easy. Jesus roughens them up a little bit. Like, Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, don't murder. I say, don't be angry. All right. That's kind of making it more rigorous rather
much
than
harder. Right.
The Pharisees are interested in how you figure out how to sanctify daily life. So you do pay attention to what you wear and what you eat and how you prepare food. Those concerns that they have, which are shared by general people, we know that archaeologically with like chalkstone vessels, which are all throughout Galilee, or mikvah ritual baths, which are all throughout Lower Galilee. They're also a wonderful form of anti-assimilationist practice. When you get Rome coming in, and Rome wants and before that Greece, where they wanted everybody to be like good Greeks or good Romans. By having these particular Pharisaic teachings, the people are able to assert their own identity over against the broader imperial concern. Today, we would call that multiculturalism, right? And they're interested in adapting. So they're not strict constructionists, to use the contemporary American term. They're saying, how do we understand this text in our own life? And they're interested in debating, which is in part why they debate with Jesus, because that's what Jews do, right? You want to figure out how to do what God wants. You have to have a conversation about it, because Torah doesn't come with an instruction manual. How do you honor the Sabbath and keep it holy? Those are good questions.
Yeah. And am I right in saying that rabbinic Judaism owes more to the Pharisees than is kind of descended from the Pharisees, or is that too much of a generalization?
There's strong connection between them.
Yeah.
There are differences, but the stuff that interests the rabbis is stuff that looks like it interests the Pharisees.
Yeah. Okay.
In terms of Sabbath observance and purity concerns and ritual washings. Back then, Pharisees, Josephus, who's this first century historian, he thinks the Pharisees are kind of uppity because he's a priest, Josephus, and priesthood in Judaism is inherited. Like if your dad's a priest, you're a priest.
Right.
And Josephus thinks people ought to be listening to the priests because they're the inherited class. And instead they're listening to this lay group. They, to use the British term, they've up-jumped. They've gotten ahead of their station. When Paul talks about his own biography in Philippians, he says, as to the law Pharisee, and under the law blameless, amemptos, he's trotting that out because that's really important. Because if he says, if I give it all up, it's all scoobula, it's all crap, in order for Jesus, well, if you give up something that's worth nothing, then it doesn't matter.
Right.
So even Paul is saying, look, this is really important. And when Paul has his road to Damascus experience, he doesn't stop being a Pharisee. He just becomes a Pharisee who believes the Messiah has come.
Exactly. I noticed
he doesn't give up. He doesn't give up being a Pharisee.
That was something that is so. In my own history, I came out of Mormonism, which is its own little journey there. But something that it's not analogous, but there is a way in which there is an entire culture and way of being as a Mormon that is, I think, distinct from, let's say,
Gentiles.
Yeah, exactly. Then right, which Mormons use that term, bless their hearts. They appropriate that. And one of the things that was very moving for me coming out of Mormonism was reading in Acts when Paul would go to temple, right? When he would go to the temple when he was in Jerusalem. And there was a part of him that, he was always Jewish, right? He didn't un-Jew himself, right? And there was a sense where I related to that as someone who comes out of a tradition that is distinct, again, not in the same ways, but there's a little bit of there's something there that resonates a little bit with, we're much younger, Mormons are much younger or whatever, but there was a sense where I was like, yeah, like there's always I'm a Mormon, right? I grew up in Utah. Like there was something about that I found really moving and beautiful. And that it doesn't have to be like a rejection of one's identity, right? And Paul, you don't see Paul doing that. You don't see any of the early Christians doing that.
Right. And when Paul, who never uses the word Christian as
right.
a self-predicating, when he's talking about don't follow the law, he's not talking to Jews.
Correct.
He's the apostle to the
exactly.
Gentiles.
He's saying that to the Gentiles. Exactly.
Right. And saying to Gentiles, no, I don't want you converting to Judaism, because if you did, the only people who would be worshiping God would be Jews. But this messianic age that we now seem to be in says that Jews and Gentiles together worship the God of Israel. The Gentiles come as Paula Fredrickson, my friend, as ex-pagan pagans. And the Jews are just Jews, but they're now Jews with a Messiah.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, I think, and we don't. I do get frustrated with my fellow Christians who don't seem to get that. Like when I preach on the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, whatever, I always try to call it back and say, look, it's not they. It's not like it's not supersessionism, right? It's Jesus was a Jew, Paul was a Jew. That Romans is clear. We're grafted into our belief is that we're grafted into the promises God made to Israel. We're not. We owe everything, right, to the
Gentile
Jews.
Gentile Christians need to be humble.
Exactly.
Need to have humility.
Yeah.
And not say
that's what Paul says. But it's not like everybody listens to Paul all the time.
Right. That's fair enough. Yeah.
Right. That's Romans. Don't be boasting in your position.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Right.
Dependent upon them.
Right.
Sure.
Right.
I do think Christianity is supersessionist. I just think you can be nice about it. I mean, I think all religions are supersessionist, because if you weren't, you wouldn't be you, right? So you're coming off of something, and then you think you're different than or have improved on something else. But there's a theologian in Canada named David Novak who talks about hard supersessionism and soft supersessionism. So soft supersessionism said we kind of got the right path here, but there's a lot of value in what you have also. And I think most traditions do that. Hard supersessionism is we've got everything and you're screwed, right? Which other traditions will do. And I don't find that terribly helpful.
Yeah.
So if I go to the Mishnah, the rabbinic sources completely write out the Sadducees. All Israel has a share in the world to come except those who deny resurrection of the dead. Okay, bye-bye, Sadducees, you're out. Because the rabbis were the historical winners, and you just write out the other people. So everybody's supersessionist to one degree or another. The reason you can have ECLA is because there are other Lutherans who didn't go in that direction, right. ELCAs. Yeah, exactly. There are other Lutherans who didn't go in that direction, and they're supersessionists over you, and work that out when the Messiah comes or comes back.
That's right.
Exactly. That's right. That's good. I love that.
So back to this a fascinating conversation. To come back to the original question, who are the marginal and the outcast? Jesus, in his answer to that, in his is very much steeped in Jewish tradition and Jewish law and Jewish thought. Can you say just a bit more, AJ, about who? What does Jewish tradition say about that? The treatment of those folks, whoever they are.
Well,
it's the orphan and the widow and the foreigner, right?
Right, the poor, the widow, the orphan, and the stranger.
Yeah.
And those are the typical models that you find in Torah. But then you have to be careful as well, because not all widows are poor. Right. So like Judith is doing really quite well.
Yeah.
Not all strangers are in a fully marginalized position either, although they might be strangers like migrant or somebody without your own people, so you're living in somebody else's land. So I want to get around language of marginal and outcast, because it doesn't mean anything. Because then you look at your church and, well, who are the marginal and outcasts here? Well, they're here, so they're obviously neither marginal nor outcast. But say, if there are people who are sick, you need to go visit them. If there are people who are poor, you need to provide them some sense of support. If there are people who have no family, you need to provide them. That's the stranger. You need to treat them like a citizen among you, because you know what it was like in Egypt when you were a stranger there. And I find rephrasing away from these labels, which are just to a more focused, here are people who need your help, and here's what you can do. And it may turn out that you, although in a well-educated or upper middle class or whatever, may find yourself also in need, because that economic status or social status doesn't prevent depression and from going away. It's not a guard against loneliness. It's not a guard against finding that you have no meaning in your own life and you feel empty. So change the labels to say reaching out to people who need that touch, people who need that recognition. Mm-hmm. And because we're all in the image and likeness of God, we can't think of ourselves as better than anybody else, because we all go back to the same parent. We are all in this together. We are our brothers and sisters keepers. So moving away from the buzzwords and actually doing the justice work that the Bible requires.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's really helpful.
Yeah, that is. Thank you for that response. That's helpful.
Yeah.
And my mother, who was a widow, really resented the idea of the poor, the widow, the orphan, and the stranger.
Yeah.
Excuse me, you're stereotyping me.
Yeah.
And assuming that I, as a member of one of these other classes, can't do anything to help, right? So you have the givers and the receivers, as opposed to everybody being in it together. Right. And I remember my mother talk about this and saying, "That's right. That's right."
Yeah.
So
yeah. Good.
Yeah. We're all both givers and receivers, right? In a healthy community. Should and be. From by the grace of God. So yeah.
Should be. And then, by the way, when you have people who really are on that kind of outcast list, parolees, people in prison, right?
Yeah.
That's where you might want to do a little bit more work. Yeah. And that's where Jesus is really good, because he says, I was in prison and you visited me. or people in the scriptures of Israel who were imprisoned, like Joseph or Jeremiah. I could work with that.
Yeah, that list in Matthew 25 would be a good place to start.
That's helpful.
I was hungry. I was in prison. I was naked. Yeah, those are the folks who going outside of stereotypes or
right. Those are the better
generalities.
categories.
Yeah.
Somebody with food instability.
Right.
Yeah. Somebody in prison. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Somebody who needs a winter coat and doesn't have one.
Right.
Yes.
Right. Yep.
More helpful than marginal and outcast.
Yeah, much more specific as well. Well, this was. Oh, did you have something else, Catherine? No. Okay. This was a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much, AJ, for being here with us. We appreciate it so much. And thank you to our listeners and those of you who are watching on YouTube for being with us on this episode of the Enter the Bible podcast. You can get more great conversations, commentaries, resources, maps, timelines, all kinds of stuff at enterthebible.org. And wherever you are consuming this podcast, whether it's on your favorite podcast app or on YouTube or whatever, be sure to like and subscribe and share this podcast with your friends. We will see you next time.